Bronchitis and pneumonia have landed Pope Francis in the hospital in recent days. Nun and medical doctor Sister Deirdre Byrne shares a physician's perspective on the Holy Father's condition. And whenever popes fall ill, inevitable questions arise about the election of the next pope and the influence of the present pontificate. The papal posse, Father Gerald Murray and Robert Royal, return with analysis. And Archbishop Joseph Naumann of Kansas City, Kansas is here to share his perspective on U.S. immigration policy. Ethicist Father Pacholczyk takes a look at the Trump administration's move to expand access to IVF. The World Over begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. An important show for you tonight. If you'd like to comment, send me an X post. I'm at Raymond Arroyo, also at Arroyo Grande Show on YouTube. To start us off, she's a medical doctor and superior of the Little Workers of the Sacred Heart, and she's here tonight with a physician's perspective on Pope Francis's current condition. The Pope continues to recover from a series of illnesses that put him in the hospital for most of the past week. Please welcome back to the program, Sister Deirdre Byrne. Thank you so much for being here, Sister. The Pope's latest health issues began last week on February 14th when he was admitted to the Gemelli Clinic in Rome for bronchitis. And as we all know now, Pope Francis lost part of one lung as a young man. And he's been prone to these bronchitis symptoms in the winter months. Sister, in your medical opinion, what makes bronchitis and the diagnosis of double pneumonia so dangerous for an elderly man with this kind of medical history?
His lungs are in an acute inflammatory process. I say acute because he has pneumonia. The bronchitis may be a chronic problem, but now he has infection in both the right and the left lung. And that right lung, we know, is just a partial lung. So I'm sure it's playing havoc on his breathing. And I also know they started him on steroids, which is a step above from just routine antibiotics, which they've got him on, because they describe polymicrobial. That means poly means many, microbial, many organisms that's attacking his lungs. So he's on steroids to try to decrease that inflammation. They mentioned he has inflammatory markers that have gotten better. So that tells me that he had bad inflammatory markers, because you and I would not have elevated inflammatory markers. So someone who's very ill will have high, and they said now it's getting better, but that doesn't really tell us what he's doing right now.
What do you make of these medical updates? I mean, you're a professional. I read this, and it's like reading Greek or Farsi here. I mean, I'll read the latest. This is from this evening. Pope Francis's condition is improving slightly. He has no fever, and his hemodynamic parameters remain stable. What does that mean to you as a professional?
That means that his blood pressure and his pulse seem okay, but they don't mention is he on any medicine to keep his blood pressure and pulse okay. They also don't mention that he is requiring oxygen. I would guess he probably is on oxygen, although I read one report that said he was not. But, you know, I have my 102-year-old mom living with us, and she also has bilateral pneumonia. She's racing the Pope to see who gets sicker, I guess. But we have her on antibiotics and oxygen just to keep her comfortable. And she's getting better. She's turning the corner. So sounds like he's stable. He's not getting worse. But we don't really know. They're being, I think, very vague. No physician could say this is the Pope status with what information they're giving us. It's very vague.
Yeah, it is curious with the world watching that they don't put a doctor forward. You know, at least his Vatican attending physician come out and just say, here's what's really going on. Here's what I see. He's walking around. I mean, he met with Maloney yesterday. He met with Prime Minister Maloney, and she said he was joking and not on oxygen.
She did say he wasn't on oxygen?
Yeah, yep.
Okay. Okay, well, that means
So,
that's a good sign. That's a good sign that he's
hmm
not on oxygen, because if he was, of course, that means
yeah.
his lungs were worse. So it sounds like he's staying the course, and you just need time, antibiotics, and go ahead.
Sister, yeah, the other point I want to dwell on, they mentioned here that he doesn't have a fever. I read in some medical journals that that might be a problem for someone this age with an infection, that he should have a fever.
Right. Now, maybe he came in with a fever because he was really sick, and now he doesn't have a fever. But someone at that age, I wouldn't hold too much weight on whether he has a fever or doesn't have a fever, because his body and his immune status is really poor. I say that because he's 88. He's got this chronic pulmonary problem, and he's on steroids. And steroids decrease the inflammation, but also increases your risk for other infections.
Sister, the Pope seems very bloated in recent days. I was sort of shocked at the pictures of him going into the Gemelli. What is that attributable to? What do you think we're
Probably
seeing there?
steroids. The steroids can do that.
Ah.
He's probably been on them chronically. He's probably been on it for a good while.
I mean, reports say he didn't even want to go to the hospital. They had to sort of drag him and tell him, look, you could die if you don't go to the hospital. So he finally went.
Either that, he went to a bad Chinese restaurant. You get a little bloated with.
Why, I hope that wasn't the case. MSG, no, we don't need that. Look, his medical team announced that the condition is stabilized and the blood work showed this slight improvement. But the thing that I have to say, it annoys me a little bit. They're reporting the blow-by-blow of everything he did. He sat up. He sat in an armchair and read the paper and had breakfast. How important is any of that? Or is that sort of a shell game where they tell us that to avoid telling us the things we really need to know?
Personally, Raymond, I think it's a shell game. I think they're trying to ease people's concern, that he's going to make it, and you really don't know. So, I mean, these visiting with the prime minister and having coffee and reading the paper, those are all good signs, especially if he's not on oxygen. But they're being so vague that it makes me feel a little suspicious that they're holding some things back. And anyhow, when you're in the hospital, you do have to take one day at a time, because anything can happen. He could get a urinary tract infection, his liver function could go out of whack. He could start having chest pain. Anything can happen. So you do have to take one day at a time, step by step. It appears as if his lungs are the big culprit.
Yeah, well, you're dealing with this with your mother. I mean,
Yeah.
when dealing with an elderly patient, what do doctors need to look for, and what do you, if you could advise from afar, what do you think the Pope's doctors are looking for now? Is he out of the woods?
No, he's not out of the woods. They're probably keeping a close watch on his other organ systems, the liver, the kidneys, the heart, to making sure that, because when you start to lose one organ system, then another and another, then you start to really get into trouble. So they're probably just closely watching all those factors, making sure that he's well hydrated, making sure his pressure stays stable. And I think I agree with you, Raymond. We do need to have a word from the physicians to allow the world to know what's going on with our Pope. And in the meantime, we continue to pray for him.
Absolutely. Sister Deirdre Byrne, always my doctor of choice. Thank you for being here, and we'll continue to keep the
Thanks,
Holy
Raymond.
Father and your mom in our prayers.
Thank you.
The Pope's health has been on all our minds this week, and with that comes the inevitable discussion of the current pontificate and what Pope Francis has been doing to shape the church structures that he will one day leave behind. Here with analysis of all of this is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Thank you all for being here. We just received a medical perspective on the Pope's health from Sister Deirdre Byrne, but I want to get your reaction to the Vatican's communications over the last 6 days or so regarding what appears to be a rather serious situation for the 88-year-old pontiff. On Thursday, the Holy See Press Office released an update which read in part that Francis had a restful night and this morning got out of bed and had breakfast in an armchair. Now, Bob, not a lot of detail there. I mean, in the afternoon, they did come back with, saying, oh, he's improving slightly. But your thoughts on what we're dealing with here, as far as the full transparency of the Vatican about the Pope's situation?
Yeah, well, we could hardly call it full transparency, can we? It's very difficult to divine what's going on with these dribs and drabs of information that we get. I actually asked a retired medical doctor, a woman who ran a clinic for many years, what she thought of the situation. She said the bloating is clearly from extended use of steroids, which is usually applied to make breathing easier. We know that he had this bilateral pneumonia, which is a pretty serious thing for anybody, but also for an 88-year-old. But it looks like things were, I mean, it looks like he was getting near the end, and then he's made something of a recovery. At this point, all we can say is we have these dribs and drabs notices. I just read today that the Swiss guards, this was in a Swiss paper, were practicing funeral exercises in case they were needed, and that the Pope's close friend Antonio Spadaro said he'll be in the hospital for at least 2 or 3 weeks. So make of that what you will.
Yeah, Father, there's also that report that the Pope told friends he might not make it through, this bout when he went into the hospital, though they're now saying he's encountering a slight improvement, whatever that means.
Yeah, it's hard to read, and I would fault the communication strategy because some days they simply talk about him reading the paper, receiving communion, and conducting business, and other days they're giving us pretty precise medical stuff. The last update as of Thursday evening is pretty vague, where it talks about a slight improvement and level of certain measurements. So it would be better if we had a medical doctor get up and speak on behalf of the Pope and just give us a whole picture, because double pneumonia combined with this steroid use, that's a pretty risky thing from what I've been reading. So we pray for the Pope's recovery, but there shouldn't be this mystery novel being written, as we speak by journalists about what's really going on. It's much better to just lay it all out.
Yeah, but gents, as we know from the death of John Paul II, the Pope is serene and in a state of comfort until he's gone. I mean, it's kind of the way this always works. Bob, a source in Rome told me that Pope Francis has been meeting with aides and may be considering rule changes for the next conclave. What are you hearing?
Yeah, I've been hearing some of the same things, and Cardinal Parolin has been in to see him, some other people as well. I hope that that's not the case, because I think if you want a prudent, orderly conclave to follow, you shouldn't leave this for the last minute when you're on all kinds of drugs and who knows what kind of mental state he's in. And we hear that he's serene and he's lucid, but what does that really mean when a person has that degree? I want to say again, I mean, to have pneumonia in both lungs is no small matter at all. And there's also, medical reactions saying that he may be developing some immunity to the antibiotics. So, look, this is not a time. This should have been, if this is going to happen, it should have been done earlier.
Yeah, well, Father, but we also learned that Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni went in, and she said he was in good spirits and telling jokes and saying, the Lord of the Harvest has decided it's not my time yet. So maybe he is recovering. But again, we don't have a full disclosure from the Vatican. But I want to get your opinion on this. Ever since Benedict XVI's abdication, the possibility of a papal resignation has been floated. That a pope could resign if his health worsens or if he feels unable to do the job. Father, do you think it's likely that Francis would resign?
Well, he did tell an interviewer that he had written a letter that if he becomes incapacitated, that he would resign. And that was sent to Cardinal Bertone, the former Secretary of State. Whether that letter is still around or it's still intentional, that's his intentions. Who knows? If the Pope himself were to resign, that would be, the last measure, because he felt he couldn't conduct the business of the pontificate. But I personally, having observed him, I don't think he's going to do that. And again, we're we're all sort of standing by, because if these rumors are true about changing the conclave rules, this is a serious matter, writing legislation and then signing it and making it public. Not the right time to do it when someone's hospitalized, and you have to say, well, what's the reason this wasn't done, the previous 11 years of the pontificate?
And we should keep in mind, the Pope has updated the rites of papal funerals last year, a second edition of the papal funeral rite. And there were reports back in 2023 that Francis was working, Father, on draft documents to reform the rules of conclave. Now, I've heard from sources that Jesuit canonist Cardinal Gianfranco Ghirlandi has paid a visit to the Pope in the hospital this week. Now, Ghirlandi has assisted Pope Francis with his changes to the governance of Opus Dei and in other matters. Bob, and then Father, what do you know about Cardinal Ghirlandi? What do you make of this?
I don't know very much about him, and I wouldn't want to speculate what exactly it might mean that he shows up there. But look, the larger question that is facing all of us, and not only popes, is that modern medicine is such that it's very easy for someone to go into a vegetative state, or to be on a respirator and being held alive by machinery, or to begin to develop the kind of mental decline that we've seen in a lot of different elder people. People are living longer, and I think all this has got to be played out in public and discussed, and we have to arrive at a solution for these things that is going to be reasonable. Because suppose the Holy Father had gone into dementia without having settled any of these things, well, then what guides the church at that point? So we need to look at this. It needs to be looked at directly. I don't think he's ever going to resign. He said himself that he thinks it's a lifelong office to become Pope, and I kind of applaud him for that, because I don't think it was a good idea when Benedict resigned. But still, these other questions that medical science now presents to us, these are going to have to be discussed, and discussed in great detail, because there's a lot that hangs from who's going to be running the Catholic Church in the world.
Father, Cardinal Ghirlanda has been called an intellectual powerhouse that's driven much of Francis's legal reforms in recent years. Your take on, and look, we don't have confirmation that he actually went to the hospital, but there are reports that he's been there.
Right. No, I know Cardinal Ghirlanda because he was my professor at the Gregorian University when I got my doctorate in canon law. In fact, he was one of the examiners on my doctrinal board. No, Cardinal Ghirlanda is one of the top canonists in the church, and the Pope relies on him. He was the one who wrote the new document about the Roman Curia. He's the one involved in the reform of the statutes of Opus Dei. He was the one who dealt with the sodalizio in Peru and other matters. Cardinal Ghirlanda is basically the Pope's right hand as regards canon law. Now, he himself is over 80, so he won't be at the conclave as a voting cardinal, but he does have a lot of influence. So who knows what's going on? Speculation is, a full-time game in Rome and at the Vatican, but certainly, the Pope has an agenda that he wants to pursue, and this illness has interrupted it to a degree, but other things he can continue to do from the hospital.
Well, I would argue that this is just a, 5-alarm fire and may hasten those reforms. But look, he's already moved at lightning speed on several initiatives over the past few years: the Synod on Synodality, the crackdown on the traditional Latin Mass. And we must remember there are currently 252 members of the College of Cardinals, and 149 of those were appointed by Pope Francis. Bob, is Pope Francis working, do you think, to complete that revolution that he first meant to bring about in the Catholic Church? And do you think this will hasten it?
Well, I think I could answer that better if I knew exactly what the revolution is. I mean, we see certain things heading in certain directions, and then in other days it seems to head off in other directions. Look, I've said this before. Even just to take the case of the number of cardinals that he's appointed to the college. Some are ideological. Some clearly are in a kind of a progressive direction, to put it that way. Others, like the new cardinal in Boston, seem to be quite mainstream and kind of American and orthodox. And then there's the wild card of those from the peripheries, from Tonga and from Turkmenistan and all these strange places that he's appointed cardinals from. So there are different things that are out there, and I think that it reflects the multiple dimensions of his own way of thinking about the church. So yes, there may be an overall kind of motion in a more progressive, what he regards as a Vatican II direction, but I just don't know. It just seems to me that there are enough wild cards in there that it's hard to predict.
Father, your take. Do you think this will hasten whatever the Pope intends to do here, because he realizes this is a reminder that he is 88 years old and that this papacy could be drawing to a close?
Hard to tell, Raymond. Certainly, if he's hospitalized for an extended period of time for a recovery, he can do a lot of work there because you simply, this stuff is like, the president's, I've got a phone and a pen. So the Pope can do that. But as Bob says, there's a lot of unpredictability here. So, we pray, we hope things go well for the Pope, but we'll find out. I mean, there's a lot, the agenda, of Pope Francis and reforming the church, it's still underway. And we'll see if the next Pope wants to continue that.
At present, there are 22 American sees just in the United States of the Latin Rite, run by bishops who are 75 years old or older. 22 dioceses. One of those is led by my next guest, Archbishop Joseph Naumann, who turned 75 in January, as did Cardinal Timothy Dolan in New York. So my question is, and Father, I'll start with you. What do you expect from the next round of appointments to the United States episcopacy? And given the Pope's health, are we about to see a flurry of appointments coming from the Vatican?
Yeah, no, it's hard to predict. There's a machinery about, within the Vatican for identifying candidates. And certainly for the United States, the predominant influence is Cardinal Supek of Chicago, because he's on the dicastery for bishops. He's a confidant of the Pope. You may recall that during the Synod, he went in to see the Pope privately with a couple of other cardinals, Cardinal Gregory and Cardinal Tobin. So I would say that if the Pope is able to make these nominations over the next few months, he could very radically reshape the future of the church in the United States by appointing like-minded people. But things don't always happen overnight. And, it's a big country. There are a lot of different people who have, displayed excellent career qualities within the diocese and would make excellent bishops. The question is, do they have the favor of Cardinal Supek and others who have influence? And that remains to be seen.
Yeah. Bob, I'll give you the last word. Will this hasten a round of appointments, do you think? This reminder of the Pope's, the shortness of his time.
Mortality.
His mortality.
Yeah. Look, I think you'd have to say, if you had to predict, sure, he will probably try to do as much as he can. But look, let's take even 25 appointments in the United States. There are 250, 280 bishops in the United States. And quite a few of them, I would say somewhere around 75% are still in the more John Paul II, Benedict XVI mode. So would it change the dynamic within the U.S. Bishops' Conference somewhat? Yes. Would it entirely change the complexion of it? My guess is no, that there would be some highly influential people pulling in a different direction. And they've been trying to do it already over the last 10, 12 years. But there still is a solid base in the United States. And also, I think that the American Catholics are just a bit different than the rest of the world. Active Catholics in the United States present a much more traditional picture than almost anywhere I can think of in the world. So bishops change, yeah, that does help some if you're a progressive, but the nature of the people, I think, there's going to be a reality principle.
We will continue to pray for the health of the Pope, and we will check in with you, gentlemen, in the days ahead. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you both for being here. In recent weeks, we've been zeroing in on the immigration issue and the Church's role in resettling migrants. Tonight, we're joined by Archbishop Joseph Naumann of Kansas City, Kansas. Archbishop, thank you for being here. You wrote a very concise and balanced column on immigration policy recently. But before I get to that, I need to ask you about the big news of the week, the Catholic Bishops' Conference is suing the Trump administration over the halting of funding for migration and refugee services. Now, according to reports, the government had allocated $65 million to the USCCB, the Bishops' Conference, for the immediate physical needs and integration of refugees into their new communities. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy are among those named as defendants. Archbishop, your thoughts on this lawsuit, which concerns $13 million that the bishops claim they're owed for resettling more than 6,000 migrants, and that would be, as of January 24th.
Yeah, I mean, the church has partnered with the government for decades now in trying to help with the immigration issue and with the resettlement of refugees. I mean, before the government, we were already doing this type of work as best we could. But we've had this long partnership with them, and I think it has saved the government money. I think we can do it more efficiently, more effectively than they could on their own. But with this breaking of the contract, I mean, it creates a real problem, and I think an injustice to break this contract. Now, at some point, if they want to not renew the contract, I think that's up to them. But to break a contract, it means that people that we've hired and employed with the expectation that they would fulfill the contract, I think it creates a real difficulty, a real problem, a real injustice.
Is it a contract, Archbishop, or is it just a flat grant? I mean, because, I know when a lot of people read this, they thought, wait, a grant is essentially monies for a job, and now that job is no longer necessary. So, is there a contract at play?
Well, you'd have to talk to the lawyers about that. But I think there was an understanding. I know we do refugee resettlement here in Kansas City, Kansas, and we get reimbursed for the services. And so I think there's been this understanding that at least for coming year, this would be in place. So, yeah, I think I understand what the administration is trying to do, but I think just pulling out of a contract in the middle of it, I think it's unjust, and if they want to change the policy at some point, then give us some leeway to adjust to it. We feel an obligation to do the best that we can to care for refugees, and we'll continue to do that whether the government assists us or not.
Vice President J.D. Vance in late January really got this debate rolling when he criticized the USCCB and implied that the conference might be enriching itself by taking government funds for migrants and refugee services. Archbishop, you wrote that you were saddened by Vance's comments. Why?
Well, because I think it's a real misunderstanding that we're not making any money off of this. We're providing services that the government's asked us to do to help them with what in the past policy has been their desire to try to help these refugees integrate into society. And I think we've done that successfully, and that's good for the country. It's good for everyone. So to accuse us of making money is just incorrect.
Last week, I spoke with the Trump border czar, Tom Homan, on the show. And part of your column on the immigration debate involved protecting the dignity of migrants and refugees. Here's what he had to say. The Pope is very concerned, Tom, about the dignity of the immigrant regardless of status. Are you and the president respecting the dignity of these deportees?
We absolutely are, and what the Pope needs to understand is that President Trump and I have been very clear that our prioritization right now are public safety threats and national security threats. These are people illegally in the United States that create horrendous crimes, commit horrendous crimes in the United States. We've seen numerous young women raped, murdered, burned alive. President Trump's policies save lives. We have a right to have a secure border. We have the right to our sovereignty, just like the Vatican has a wall around them. We have a right to protect American citizens. We have a right to reduce illegal alien crime in this country, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Archbishop, your reaction. In your recent column, you commended the administration for taking this threat of criminal illegal aliens seriously.
Yes, yeah, I think that's part of the government's responsibility to protect its own citizens. So, yeah, personally, I think they should be commended. And the prior policy, I think, was irresponsible in allowing these people to enter the country that are violent criminals. I think the challenge becomes is there's many that came, they have no criminal history, they've created no crimes here other than entering without proper documentation. And what happens to these several million people? How do we care for them and respect their dignity? I don't dispute at all the need for the administration to get rid of violent criminals, members of cartels or gangs. But I think that's not most of the immigrants.
Yeah, I want to get your thoughts on just what you raised there, that, many of these people, most of these people, I've seen these people. I've actually helped them get off boats as they cross the Rio Grande. But the reality is there is a rule of law in place. And you wrote the following: the vast majority of the people who entered our country illegally are not gang members or criminals or drug dealers, what you just said, nor are they posing a threat to national security, but have come fleeing poverty in their homeland with a sincere desire to better provide for the material needs of their families. But Archbishop, regardless of why these migrants come, aren't Catholics, and that includes migrants and refugees, required by the Church to respect the laws of the place in the countries they enter? I mean, the rule of law is not optional here.
Yeah, there is an obligation, and in the Catechism we talk about that those who come to a country have a responsibility to observe those laws. I think unfortunately we've had a policy, but the way the government has acted, at least in recent years, was actually encouraging these immigrants to come. And so I think they've come, they're here now. Many of them have become contributing members of the community. Sometimes there's different families have different status. Some are here legally, some are not. And that's one of our concerns too, is do we separate families? And is it really going to help the country to do this mass deportation of those that aren't criminals, aren't gang members, aren't members of cartels? And is there a way to create a path for citizenship? And if not citizenship, maybe some kind of legal presence with worker permits.
Archbishop, what do you make of the critique? And I've seen this a lot online over the last week or so. When was the last time we heard the Pope or the bishops in unison speak out so forcefully on a moral issue like abortion or IVF or any of these other issues, and suddenly there's this unified chorus around this issue of illegal immigration, which frankly is within the prudential judgment of those elected?
Yeah, in my column, I talk about how the church and the government have different responsibilities here. I think a government does have a responsibility to protect its own citizens. As the church, we don't determine who's here legally or not, but we try to serve whoever's here because we respect their dignity as one made in the image of God, one for whom Jesus Christ gave his life on Calvary. So there is a difference between what the government might perceive at a given moment is necessary, and what we as a church are trying to do is simply to help people. And our concern now is these people have in some ways been almost invited to come, and now this mass deportation of those who aren't criminals, we think is going to create a new chaos within our society and culture.
This is, look, the Trump executive orders no doubt have caused their own tumult in Catholic Charities and Catholic Relief Services, because so many of those funds are suddenly frozen. I know, Catholic Relief Services laid off half their staff already. The question I'm going to pose to you is, do you believe the church should have been so dependent in these charitable extensions, these charitable outreaches upon government funds, so they wouldn't be in this position?
Well, Raymond, I think, there's been a history of a partnership with the church and the government. And I think as long as the government saw this as a way of achieving their objectives in terms of building relationships with other countries and helping those, we've seen some of these terrible things that Doge has uncovered about how money has been misused for really trying to inflict a woke ideology on people. And that's certainly something the church, we're concerned about that too, that the government's misusing money in those areas. But our effort is to give food to people, to make sure they have clean water, to help them know how to farm in a way that's going to help them provide for themselves and their families. And as long as the government would partner with us and not have us violate our own beliefs, I think that's been a good partnership. If the government no longer wants to do that, we're going to continue to try to do what we can with the donations of our people. Before it's been a partnership with the government and those donations, and I think we've accomplished more than the government could have done on its own and we could do on our own.
Before we run out of time, the newly appointed Archbishop of Detroit, Edward Weissenberger, once suggested when he was Bishop of Tucson back in 2018 that canonical penalties, the withholding of communion, etc., should be considered for Catholics who were involved in border enforcement practices that, in the bishop's estimation, were morally wrong. Border Patrol agents and ICE officials. Archbishop, do you agree with your brother bishop's suggestion there?
Yeah, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that those kinds of, they're just doing their job. They're doing what they've been called to do by the government. Now, if they do it in an abusive way, if they disrespect people, then yeah, I think that could be a problem. But if they're just doing their job, no, I don't think they should be denied the Eucharist.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think and if they're abusing their jobs, they should be criminally prosecuted as well. Archbishop Joseph Naumann, thank you so much for being here, for your clarity on this issue. And I think an opinion and a peace that bridges the charity and the love of the church for all people, regardless of who they are, and the obligations of the government in this moment. So thank you for that. It's a rarity.
Thanks, Raymond.
This week, I sat down with parenting expert and author Dr. Meg Meeker on the Arroyo Grande podcast. We talked about the rise of anxiety and depression among our young people and what parents can do practically. And then I asked her this. Are we too quick to push children into therapy, do you think?
Yes, I think we are, because I think that parents fail to recognize how critical they are in their child's development, emotionally, physically, mentally. And I think that whenever something goes wrong with a child, rather than saying, oh, I could be part of this, I'm part of the solution or remedy, but they don't know what to do, or they don't want to take the time to do it, so they just give them to a therapist. But any child who goes to a therapist is going to be quickly followed by mom and dad, because you can't treat a child in isolation. You have to treat the unit. Parents often ask me, I have a full-time job. My husband has a full-time job. We have a babysitter 50 hours a week. That child's going to have trouble. Kids are not made to be raised in institutions or just by nannies. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for that, but that's okay. My job is to speak for children, not for their parents.
This is one of those episodes every parent should watch. The entire Arroyo Grande interview with Dr. Meg Meeker is on YouTube at Arroyo Grande Show or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Just go there, hit the subscribe button. You can visit RaymondArroyo.com for all the links. President Trump signed a new executive order this week expanding access to the controversial and morally questionable IVF procedure. And Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is launching an investigation into the safety of the abortion pill, mifepristone. Here to unpack it all, neuroscientist and senior ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, Father Tad Pacholczyk. Father, welcome back to the show. I want to start with these executive orders expanding access to IVF that the president has signed. Now, he's long been an advocate of this procedure, at least since the last campaign. And I asked him about this last October, just weeks before his election. Watch.
The other day you said, I'm the father of IVF. As you know, some Catholics feel, and the Catholic Church believes, when you implement this technology, you're killing embryos. Will you have a religious exemption to your IVF mandate for religious organizations and businesses that feel this violates my religious principles?
Well, you know, I haven't been asked that, but it sounds to me like a pretty good idea, frankly. But even Catholics, a lot of them, they want IVF. It's fertilization, basically. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they view that as helping a family, helping parents have a child. And it's a very popular thing, but certainly if there's a religious problem, I think people should go with that.
Father, I want to get to this religious exemption in a second, but the president, like so many Christians and frankly Catholics, view IVF as simply another means of having children. It's just fertilization, the president said there. Tell us what the moral concerns are with this technology.
Well, you know, I think it's good to start out and emphasize that it's good to hear the president seeing the importance of family formation. And, you know, this is really a classical question of good ends and a question of what are the appropriate means to pursue that. So, you know, there are a number of concerns that arise in the wake of this technology. This has been a technology that has just galloped forward, largely driven by commercial concerns. And I mean, among the concerns that just immediately bubble up, you hinted at it in your question to the president, there is this propensity to produce extra embryos, many of whom will either be discarded or frozen. And sometimes they get caught in stasis for literally decades or forever. They're never rescued out of that freezing situation. There are also other concerns when people do in vitro fertilization. There is known to be a higher risk of birth defects in the babies that are born this way. There's a lot of other, you know, untoward things that occur. For example, sex selection of the embryo. Do you want a boy? Do you want a girl? Trait selection, other types of screening that goes on. So there's this quality control, which is, of course, just a fancy word for eugenics that is part and parcel of this entire technology. And finally, you know, you've certainly heard of the situations when people are implanted with 3 or 4 embryos, and what happens if they all take? Well, then you have to have what's called a selective reduction, and they go in and destroy 1 or 2 of the growing babies in that case to help with the pregnancy for the remaining 2 babies. So, you know, these are all reminders to us of how this is called a pro-life, pro-family technology, but at its core, it's not. It's actually a two-edged sword, and there's a death-dealing edge to the sword that pops up throughout the entire practice of in vitro fertilization.
Father, you raised the moral concerns here about IVF. On the other hand, in the Catholic sphere, and this is where I think a lot of the confusion comes from, we've heard of adopting these embryos that are frozen, where women come in and say, you know, I'm going to adopt this frozen embryo, and she has it implanted in her womb, and now, you know, does that suddenly make it moral? Is it now a moral good?
Well, I think that, first of all, the Church, in its most recent document on the question of embryo adoption, was very clear that there are significant concerns around this. And in some cases, it pointed out that it's not allowed at all. For example, if it's done as a treatment for infertility, it is not allowed at all. So you ask yourself, all right, if the church is saying there are some circumstances in which embryo adoption is simply forbidden, then, what's behind that? There's a lot of concerns. And so the other piece, though, you got to be practical here, Raymond, I think. You got to understand we have a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they're going to be very interested in something like this, because then they'll say, well, then we can produce as many extras as we need. We can even make more of them, because now we have a new market. We can start selling these embryos, or they won't call it that. They'll call it facilitating the transfer to couples that might be willing to do something like an embryo adoption. So you actually feed into the cycle of cooperation in evil by promoting something like this.
Father, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled over a year ago that frozen embryos created via IVF are children under Alabama state law. Your thoughts on that ruling, and does that really take care of the moral dilemma created by IVF in the first place?
Well, I think certainly that ruling was the first kind of legal attempt to bring some coherence to this issue. I think we have had a lack of coherence where, on the one hand, if a couple wants an embryo, then the embryo has to be protected. They would be concerned if the clinic was to lose the embryo or destroy the embryo. But then on the other hand, as soon as the clinic wants to discard embryos, then they just become cells and property. So we've been in this situation where we're calling the embryo different things depending on what it is we want. And I think the Alabama decision cut through that and said, no, we can't do that. We've got to be consistent and coherent here.
So, Father Tad, I don't want to run out of time. If you were advising the Trump administration on policy vis-a-vis IVF, what would you tell them?
Well, Raymond, I think there are a number of things. One is regulation is what's needed here, not cooperation or encouragement of this practice. We need to do something like Italy and Germany have done, where they say whenever you do IVF, you're not allowed to make extra embryos. You can only make a maximum of 3, all of whom must be implanted into the mother. So regulation instead of funding and cooperation. Secondly, I think we should set up some advisory commissions here. I don't know if you remember during the first Trump term, he set up something called the Human Fetal Tissue Ethics Advisory Board. And I actually was a member of that board, and we made decisions about funding for experiments that used fetal tissue. It was amazing, the work that they did. And, we need some more advisory commissions like that. You may recall under George Bush, the President's Council on Bioethics did similar work and advising. There was nothing comparable under Obama or Biden. And then, another thing that needs to be done here, we need to fund and promote real treatments for infertility. So in other words, figure out what are the underlying causes. Why is this couple not able to have a baby? That whole approach gets sidelined as soon as you offer the IVF industry to couples. They go down that road almost immediately.
Well, not to interrupt, but we should be offering NAPRO technology and so many of these other, not only morally agreeable techniques, but proven advances in medicine that have helped families have children.
Absolutely. And to make sure that there is good insurance coverage and reimbursement for all of those, because so often couples are like, well, that sounds good, but that's not going to fit under my plan. So very, very important to do that. And, use other approaches to supporting and encouraging those who desire larger families. Simple things like tax breaks, fair wages for the breadwinner, creative solutions to pay for high educational costs, and, for healthcare. Healthcare, when you're thinking of having a large family, you worry about that kind of thing as well.
I've got to move on to this. An announcement by the new HHS Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He wants to start an investigation into the safety of the abortion pill. Here's the quote. What Trump has asked me to do is study the safety signals, and I think that's worth doing. Father, your thoughts on this and the risks of this abortifacient pill?
This is a common sense type of a request coming from the president. This is something that's routinely done when new pharmaceuticals come into the market. You want to track side effects, deleterious outcomes, and there's been a kind of squelching of that. And I'm glad to see that there is, at a minimum, some call here for coherence around this issue as well. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's a tragedy that so many abortions are going in the direction of the abortion pill. The percentage is rising each year, and it's important that we track at least the side effects and dangerous outcomes that are part and parcel of this.
Father Tad Pacholczyk, we will leave it there, and you can read Father Tad's commentary on the National Catholic Bioethics Center website. They're at ncbcenter.org. Father Tad, thanks.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you, Raymond.
As we mentioned, Pope Francis added 21 new red hats to the College of Cardinals. There are now 253 members of that college, with 140 eligible to vote in the next conclave. But how well do we know these men? And how well do these men know each other? Here to tell us about the new project he's working on to facilitate this getting to know you process is senior correspondent at the National Catholic Register, Edward Penton. Ed, tell me about this new project you're collaborating on. It's called the College of Cardinals Report, and it's a web-based expansion of your book, The Next Pope. Why update it now?
Yes, exactly, Raymond. Well, this whole project really came to fruition, the book first of all, but now this, because we got so many requests from cardinals and others saying that they wanted this kind of resource so that they could know who the cardinals are and where they stand on particular issues, and to have a sort of website, an interactive website to do that. And this is the first ever project really that has a sort of interactive element where you can filter cardinals according to whatever who appointed them and what nation and so forth. We have a map, an interactive map where you can have a statistical breakdown of geographically where they are. But perhaps probably the most and also we have a table of contents where you can, for the 40 in-depth cardinals that 40 profiles that we've covered in depth, that you can actually see through this table where they stand on particular issues. And we have, as I say, 40 in-depth profiles. Yeah.
As I mentioned in the intro, Ed, the college keeps growing, and the men who will elect the next pope know very little about each other. How does the College of Cardinals report seek to alleviate that problem?
Yes, well, as I say, the fact that we have 40 in-depth profiles, Raymond, so we have a lot of detail on these 40 cardinals, many of whom are papabili, as we say. They're eligible to be pope. And we have summary profiles of all the other ones. But what's really a novelty about this site, we think, is that it's interactive in many different ways. Not only can you sort of find filter different cardinals according to their location and so forth, and use a map and get a geographical breakdown, statistical breakdown of the cardinals, but we're also inviting readers to submit any amendments or additions so that we can, keep the content live, as it were, and make it truly interactive, so that the faithful and cardinals themselves can chip in and improve the profile, make it more a fuller profile, if you like. So, and they'll all be vetted, and we'll keep it as accurate as we can, and we're hopefully very accurate.
So this is kind of like your own little Wikipedia breakdown of these cardinals. I'm worried about community notes starting to be fired at you, Ed, but I'm glad you're editing this and this isn't, subject to outside manipulation. You're working with independent journalist Diane Montagna, along with the Sophia Institute Press. Tell us about the technical aspects of the site. How will this information be organized? Give us a sense. I know you've got cross-references like crazy.
Yes, exactly, and everything's a lot of it's hyperlinked. But we have yes, this each category is, you can, as I say, you can filter the cardinals according to their age, their nationality, who made them cardinal, and so forth. And we have, as I say, this table of 10 different core issues that are very important today, certainly very topical today. and you can see where each cardinal stands on those issues with the color-coded table. And we hope to obviously increase that as time goes on. We have, I think, 22 or more perhaps who are on that table. No, we have 40, sorry, 40 we have there. But we hope to increase it to as many of the cardinal electors at least as we can, and that's up to 140 now.
Ed, if you were handicapping the top cardinals to watch, they would be whom? Give me your top three.
Yes, I mean, I never like to make these predictions because, as we know, it's a real lottery. But I think it's interesting to see who the emerging ones are. And certainly we have Cardinal Pier Battista Pizzaballa, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. He's certainly up and coming. He's only 58 now, so he's probably too young to be seriously considered. But he is certainly somebody who's coming up through the ranks. There's also Cardinal Jean-Marc Aveline of Marseille, who's known as the Pope's favorite, and he's sort of emerging as also another leading candidate. I think he's in his mid-60s, so probably about the right age, if you like. And then we have Cardinal Ambongo, Fridolin Ambongo of Kinshasa, who's also rising up through the ranks as a sort of new African cardinal hopeful, as Cardinal Sarah was for many years, but some think that he's getting a little too old now to be seriously considered Pope. But Cardinal Ambongo is seen as somebody who's certainly emerging as a strong contender.
And Cardinal Erdo, I noticed you had on your homepage of the site.
Yes,
who's, been talked about for a long time.
Exactly, yes. I mean, you've got these candidates who've been talked about for some years now. Cardinal Erdo is one of them, yes. And, of course, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State at the Vatican, he's another one. And, there are quite a few different candidates out there who've been in the rank, who've been in the making of Papabli, being seen as Papabli for some time, yeah.
Yeah, well, Ed, I like that it's a quick digest, and you can read these sort of amended bios of these men. That also takes into consideration their view on certain theological controversies, their liturgical tastes. It's kind of a one-stop shop and a very convenient tool, certainly for these cardinals, but also for the general public, for the general Catholic looking in on the process. Ed, we'll leave it there. You can find the College of Cardinals report at collegeofcardinalsreport.com. Thank you, Ed. That is all the time we have for now. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.